now that the introductions are out of the way, this is just the brief agenda. We're going to start with OU3, and then I think we're taking a break, and then Tom and Chris will follow up with updates on OU1 and OU2. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so this is the site. I imagine some of it might be a little difficult to read, but basically I just want to point out OU1 is in the blue boundaries and the yellow represents OU2. We all know what's in them, but my portion here is going to be with OU3, which is site-wide groundwater, which the definition that we're using, that it's groundwater at or surrounding the site, the landfill, that is been impacted by contaminants from the site. So that's our, but it also includes background locations away from the landfill, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that in a little bit. So in the last 8 months, since the last TCAG meeting, we've been busy. The respondents have been busy. Monitoring wells have been installed. There's been ongoing quarterly groundwater sampling. The next annual report for the 2023 is in progress, and we should have that at the beginning of April. And then we should also be talking a little bit about next steps as we move down the road here. All right, so OU3 update. Again, the next slide will have a little more detail, so don't worry if you can't read everything on here, but I just wanted to point out, orient you a little bit. So the red line here shows where the site boundary is. And then we have a bunch of wells. So the orange dots represent on-site wells, green dots, circles, are off-site wells, and then which includes the background wells. A little hard to see, but in these yellow outline boxes at the bottom, they show that we have background wells that are located 2 miles south of the site. And then there's some wells, background wells, just within half a mile east of the site. One other feature on this is these blue squares. They represent step-out well locations that have been proposed. They're in the process of being installed. For example, these 2 green dots are now part of the offsite network. They used to be proposed, but just in November, those were put in. They haven't been sampled yet, but they will be soon. And so there's a couple of locations for proposed step-out wells here. And then there's one up here by the red dot, and then a couple more over here and over here. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So we brought along some show and tell items here, larger maps that, please come up and take a look. These 2 are some groundwater results, and then there's a third one that shows what you can see up there. It's just a large format figure for the offsite and the onsite wells. Do we want to pass those around now? Wait. They're kind of big, but okay. Okay, and then the other feature, I think you all know, but the Missouri River is up here in the left corner. So just for help orient you a little bit. Now this is a close-up of the north end. Wow, those colors of the site, just to give you an idea. Again, same color scheme. Orange circles are on-site, green off-site, blue step-out wells that are being proposed. And actually, the crew is out there today drilling some of these as we speak. So one thing I wanted to touch on here was these well locations. There are a lot of identifiers. So we have 2 types of wells. We have multi-level wells and we have single screen wells. The difference being the multi-level wells are installed in one borehole. You drill one hole, you put multiple screens at different depths. It leads to certain efficiencies in sampling but the biggest thing is if you have space constraints, as you do at a lot of these offsite locations, they're active facilities. The owners don't want a bunch of wells on their property, so it makes sense sometimes to put in one hole and have everything in it. Sometimes there's buildings nearby, there's subsurface utilities you have to navigate, so it helps with that as well. Instead of just putting a single screen well and then moving over 10 feet, putting another one in at a different depth. So it's an efficient way it can be an efficient way to get these things in the ground. All right, so before we get into some of the other details about the wells and the sampling, we just want to talk about groundwater and routes of exposure. So far, there's no current known routes of exposure. The PRPs have done an offsite well inventory. Revised report was just recently submitted. Eventually, I believe that will get posted to the dashboard. It's in the process of, we have to redact some of the information. There's personally identifiable information in it, so we need to make sure that stuff gets removed and scrubbed before we put it out for public view. And so most of the folks in the area are on public water supply. They have a connection. And we have not been able to identify any private wells that are used for drinking water. So, so we're looking good on that front. Vapor intrusion, the concern there is vapors coming off, primarily vapors coming off the groundwater, entering buildings or utility corridors, what have you, anywhere that somebody could inhale those vapors. The thing is, the concentrations in the groundwater are pretty low, so this has been looked at, and based on the level of concentrations in the water, it's not really considered an issue at this point, but that's something we'll keep an eye on and evaluate as we go forward as needed. Okay, so a little bit about the timeline of sampling. So, so this shows across the top, we have on-site wells and off-site wells, and then in the left-hand column are the different quarterly events. Usually the Q1 happens in February, and then May, August, November. So the on-site wells were first sampled in the last quarter of 2020, and it's been an ongoing thing since then. So there's been 13 total events with the on-site, and then off-site wells were initially sampled in August of 2022, and we just completed the 6th round of quarterly sampling. But as of today, we only have the second quarter of this year's data available. Q3, which was collected in August, we should have that soon. There was an issue with the lab reporting system that delayed the delivery of the data packages to the respondents in a timely manner. So we don't have that yet, but it is something that will be included in the 2023 annual report that's due in the spring. More on the sampling. So there's been a slight modification to the frequency of the sampling. It's a little bit of background on that. So initially, the plan and the RI, the remedial investigation work plan, was to finish everything by August 2022. The well network would have been in place. And then the plan was to sample that network for 8 consecutive quarters going forward. But the detections in off-site locations required a significant expansion of the network in order to delineate exactly where the impacts are found. So a lot more wells were put in. We're still putting them in as we chase the edges of the impacts. And so it's an iterative approach. You step out some distance that you think that makes sense. You put in wells, you get the information, you find impacts, you have to step out further. So you're trying to find the edge. And so it's a data-driven, iterative approach that takes some time, but in the end, it's probably the most efficient way to go about chasing where the impacts are. So well installation impact activities are ongoing, and so while that's happening, there's a temporary change in the sampling frequency. So the temporary change incorporates that after 8 consecutive quarters of sampling, we're going to temporarily pause the sampling on the on-site wells. We have a lot of data from them, so that will be paused, and then the perimeter and off-site wells will, again, temporarily switch to an annual sampling. So, and then once the well network is complete, once all those proposed locations and any other locations that are identified as we get more data, once that network is done, we will sit down and relook at the sampling frequency and make adjustments accordingly for the rest of the remedial investigation NFS process. Just to give you an idea of what sampling involves, groundwater sampling. So there's a team, there's multiple teams of multiple people, and it takes them about a month to sample all the well network. It's pretty labor intensive. And on the right in the table is a list of all the things that are analyzed for. There's 18 separate categories, and that totals something like over 300 different analytes. So there's a lot of data is generated with each sampling event. And it takes, like I said, a month to complete it. And then once the data are collected and the lab has analyzed everything, they deliver the data packages. But you're not done yet. You have to validate the data. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds with that, but about it. But I'm certainly willing to if there are questions. But basically, data validation is a process of looking at the data, looking at the QA/QC, the quality assurance, quality control that was done, just to make sure that the data is up to snuff. You just don't take that data and set it out there and this is it. This is what we found. So that process also takes time. I've done data validation. It's mind-numbing work. It's a lot of attention. It's a lot of attention to detail and crossing your T's and dotting your I's. It just, I'm sure by now, though, it's computerized to a certain extent, but you do need that human element in that process. Okay, so a little bit about groundwater screening levels, the metrics that we use to compare the groundwater results to. So we have maximum contaminant levels, MCLs, which are federal regulatory limits for finished drinking water. And they're typically the most stringent levels that you can find. I think there's MCLs for something like 90 different contaminants, but not all contaminants have MCLs. And for those that don't, there are regional screening levels. And those represent concentrations at which additional investigation may be warranted. So our RSLs are not cleanup levels. 1,4-dioxane, which is one of the big drivers at this site, it is one such compound. It has no MCL, but it has an RSL. Someday there may be an MCL, but we're not there yet. Okay, so there's a lot going on this slide. This shows the most up-to-date groundwater results for a selection of off-site wells for a select 4 analytes, the dioxane, vinyl chloride, radium, 226 and 228, and arsenic. There's a lot more in the way of contaminants out at the site, but these are just sort of representative. These are things you see most often in the groundwater. A little bit about what's on this slide. So ND is not detected. That means it's below a concentration that the lab cannot see. So it doesn't mean it's zero, but it just means they can't detect it. It's below a certain level. The other thing that you see on these slides are some letters, J's, and other places you'll see U's. Those are data flags. That's an outcome of what the lab does. The lab sticks some of those qualifiers onto the data. Other qualifiers get added during that data validation process that I mentioned. And typically you'll see U's and J's. U means it's not detected, undetected. J means it's estimated. If it's the plus sign after the J, that tells you that for some reason the data validator or the lab thinks that it might be biased to the high side, but it's still estimated, but usable. And J minus is maybe it's biased a little low. So might be a little more information that you want to know. I can give you more if you want to get into the weeds on that. Just let me know, and can explain that. A little bit about detection limits too. There are method detection limits and there are reporting limits. Method detection limits are lower. So those are typically specific to a contaminant. They're specific to a lab. It's a statistically based number that can change over time because the labs are continually evaluating the results, and so the statistics can change. And then the reporting limit is higher than the method detection limit, the RL. It's usually some factor, multiplication factor bigger than the MDL, usually 2 or 3 times. So it's what can be quantified. Yes. The lab can actually calculate a number, a reliable number. It's different. One you can detect it, and the other well. Right. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at all these. Whenever you see an ND, well, the first question that comes to my mind, well, what is that number? So and why is it that way? So okay, so this is a figure. Earlier I said there was no Q3 data. Well, there's some for 1,4-dioxane. It's draft. It's not validated. It hasn't gone through that process where it's looked at for all the details about how it was analyzed. So this is 1,4-dioxane results for the third quarter of this year. So again, it's draft. It's not validated. And it's also based on the reporting limits, which are those numbers that are higher than the method detection limits. Once it goes through the validation process, then a lot of those reporting limits will become lower and be at the method detection limit. But again, like I said, we're expecting that data to come through soon. So this is a snapshot of what the shallow alluvium, that's the first layer of sand and gravel and silt and clay that is filling in the eroded in the bedrock valley that was created by the Missouri River. So it's sand and gravel and silt and clay. I know it's not readable, but just concentrate on the dots. So the darkest dots that you see, the dark blue, are the highest concentrations. They represent more than 100 micrograms per liter of 1,4-dioxane. And then the lightest color blue is less than 10 micrograms per liter. And then the intermediate size circles are in between the big ones and the small ones. So a couple more slides. Correct. Just got this data back, so
will be evaluated and additional work will be proposed.
Is it comes to the river?
That's the direction, the river is in that direction.
In the direction.
And there's additional wells to the north, to the west, excuse me, between those 2 points and the river that are being installed. Those are some of the proposed ones. So we're chasing it, like I said, stepwise. You step out one step, and if you need to go a second step, you do that. So right now we're in the process of that second step out with the drilling and well installations. So again, another snapshot of also 1,4-dioxane, but it's for a slightly deeper unit. It's still in the sand and gravel in the alluvium, but this is for the lower part of the alluvium, that part of the sand and gravel that occurs right above bedrock. So so you see a similar sort of thing. You see at the perimeter, at the western edge, you see some of the higher concentrations. And then, as you can see, stepping out off-site, there are some impacts there as well. And so just to talk a little bit about groundwater flow here, it is to the northwest toward in the general direction of the river. And so that's why that's largely guiding where the offsite wells are put. It's going in this direction. Well, this is where we're going to put the wells. And again, it's not just one direction. It can be a range of directions, depending on, how much rain we've gotten, the season, what the level of the Missouri River is. The Missouri River can affect groundwater flow generally temporarily. So there is variation. So that's why there's never just one flow direction. This shows bedrock impacts. This is the St. Louis and Salem limestone formations. Fewer wells, but still you see sort of a similar pattern, the darker blue with the higher concentrations near the perimeter, and there are impacts off-site as well in the down gradient direction. And that's what we're in the process of chasing down. How far does that go? Again, this is the close-up of the southern portion of the landfill. So you can get an idea. Again, the orange is on-site wells, green off-site, and also background, but there are no background wells in this figure. The yellow concentrations below the well identifiers, these are radium 226, 228 concentrations in picocuries per liter. So it's the yellow numbers represent where it's less than the MCL, the maximum contaminant level of 5 picocuries per liter. In some cases, again, you see the U, it's 1.52 U, for example, here. That means it was not detected that concentration. So it's something below 1.62. And then the orange concentrations are represent where the radium is above the 5 picocuries per liter metric that we are using. So there's a couple spots where we see that, but they're not terribly above the MCL, but they are above it. And we see that in same thing in some of the background wells with radium. A lot of it's non-detect or low, but then there are some spots where it's right around 5-6 picocuries per liter.
You can see from that most of the concentrations above the MCL are on site and at the perimeter. Off site, they're almost all below
Right.
MCL.
And thank you for bringing that up. And so that reminds me that the reason we're using 1,4-dioxane for a lot of the decisions about where to put wells, that's the main driver, because it really it's a readily dissolvable in groundwater. It travels far, farther than many other contaminants. So it's a good proxy, if you will, or seeing the full picture of where the impacts are. And it's 1,4-dioxane is also one of the more widely detected contaminants in groundwater. So it's a good way to figure out where the full extent is. So this is the northern half, equivalent of the previous slide. Same color scheme, shows one of the proposed locations up here, which will be installed soon. We had to step out, so because there were 1,4-dioxane impacts at this well, which I believe is MW 406 offsite well. We saw impacts there. So given the northwest, again, north is up on this figure, given the northwest direction of groundwater flow, we there's a proposed location that will go here, and there's a couple more off the edge of this figure that are up here to the north and northwest that will also be put in to sort of see, you know, whether things have moved off in that direction as well. The dioxane in some, yes, in some cases for 1,4-dioxane. This is a radium figure. I figured there might be a greater level of interest, so we're showing just not on the slides, but this, for example, is a 1,4-dioxane figure. That is right.
Well, we're to test any contaminant.
Right.
1,4-dioxane moves faster than most contaminants. So by finding the 1,4-dioxane, you are pretty much assured that you have found the contaminants.
Right, it's
the
the
whole
direction.
Right.
Right.
But then the wells are sampled for all the contaminants.
Yeah, we're not ignoring the other contaminants.
The
No.
orange ones are. Green is below, orange is above.
Yeah.
So it's a proposed well.
And it's proposed because of 1,4-dioxane.
Okay. So there's no concentration.
Like that is one result in an offsite well where the radium is just above the MCL by 0.76. It is an estimated value, but like Snee said earlier, we do see some results from the background wells, which are to the south and east of the site, right around that 5 picocurie per liter level. So
How are you explaining that?
there's naturally occurring radium.
You're evaluating.
Well, so we have to figure out what amount of naturally occurring radium is present in groundwater and account for that in order to figure out the impact that the site
What's
was
that
having.
number?
And you can see
This number that you're looking at offsite rating.
it's 5.
Right.
It's
between 5 and 6.
below 6 at this point. That is the MCO for finished drinking water.
I know,
Right,
I'm just saying.
right.
So you're gonna have a hard time convincing anybody that that's that. I'm just gonna lay it out. It's.
Well, there's a lot of data that will be collected.
We're
That
not trying to
will be
convince,
evidence-based. We're not trying to convince you of anything
in
yet.
order to compel a cleanup, in order to get to a cleanup, we're required to account for what is naturally occurring. It's understood. We must do.
And everybody in this room understands that. What I am telling you is definitely account for it, definitely go through your thing, but do not come back and tell anybody here, oh, it's all right, it's a close, little under 6, it's okay, little under 5, it's background. Don't do that. You know us, we know you. We're not gonna do that, okay? It's there for a reason.
Well-
We don't have that.
There are background levels that can be above MCO.
Oh, sure
that
they
is-
can, but not that.
That's just barely above MCO. So there are concentrations
In the state
across the
right
country.
here that aren't impacted by the manhunt.
That's, well,
We're evaluating that. There are concentrations above MCLs that occur naturally. We're evaluating whether that occurs here or not.
all we're telling you today is that the background data set that we've just started to collect, we only have three rounds.
Yep.
The
Something like that.
background data set that we've just started to collect does have results right around and just above 5 picocuries per liter. But we do not have an answer to when you see a result off-site, if it's 5, if it's 6, if it's 7, whether that's naturally occurring or includes impacts from the site. But what we want you to know is that we are seeing concentrations around that range and background. And so part of SNA's job and the PRP's job, they have to look very closely at that, look at the statistics for background wells, and we'll have to figure out how much of naturally occurring radiant is in these offsite downgrading wells when we're evaluating whether and what type of cleanup has to.
You can check in the boxes. We definitely want you to do that, just to reiterate. But it's a little upsetting to see it that high. And I will say, it's not as bad as I saw it in my mind. I'll give you that. However, this is upsetting. Upsetting.
Yeah, are you seeing any the dioxins in the south, in the wells to the south?
In the background wells, our dioxane is largely non-detect. We may,
We'll show you the maps.
and yeah, again, well, I can look here and tell you right now. So for the wells at the south, 2 miles south of the site, which are in this box, shown this box, all of the 1,4-dioxane are non-detects. They're blue concentrations. And then for the background wells, half a mile east of the site, again, at least in Q2 of this year, they're all non-detected as well. 1,4-dioxane.
I was gonna talk about this, but 1,4-dioxane is a man-made chemical. It's not naturally occurring, whereas radium is naturally occurring. So
And I will just say that there are ways to scientifically look at whether something is background or associated with site based on the ratio of different isotopes. And that's one of the primary things that we're going to be looking at is the ratio of the isotopes that are associated with contamination and the ratio of isotopes that are naturally occurring. And we will evaluate these in these wells to help understand that situation.
I think the big thing here is that they're being very transparent. And they are letting you know that there is continuous sampling and evaluation and ongoing. They want to make sure you understand that they're being totally transparent about what they're seeing. And they have a lot more work that they're going to be evaluating and looking at and sampling. And there's a lot more work to do here. So it's not a done deal. It's absolutely, we're going to ignore anything.
And we will keep
But they're just
providing the information and discussing it
continuous
with you.
communication.
Okay. So far we've been talking mostly, in 2 dimensions, north, south, what's north, south, east, west. So I just wanted to include this to give you a cross-sectional view. So what we're looking at here is a cross-section through the Missouri River Valley down here. So it's along the western edge of the landfill, this green line. So north, running from north to south. So what you see here is in the gray is all bedrock units, and then the yellow is the alluvium that we talked about earlier, the sand and gravel, silts and clays that have filled in the bedrock valley that was created by the Missouri River. This is the radium map. This is taken from the 2022 annual report. We don't have the 23 report yet, so we're using this one. So this shows radium in the wells. Each one of these vertical lines represent a well or a series of the multi-level wells. These smallest dots are either no detect or radium that's less than the MCL of 5. And then the larger dots are, the circles are where you have radium above the MCL. So you can see the lower portion of the alluvium is impacted for the most part. And so just wanted to make sure that we have in our minds that it's not just 2 dimensions, it's 3 dimensions. And so all that is being evaluated.
I understand, and we do have some data from the wells from previously, but I have not compared what we saw previously. So I'm not sure I can answer the question. We are seeing concentrations from almost non-detect up gradient or non-detect that increase down gradient. They do, get lower as you move away from the site.
I'm
But-
just wondering, are we on the safer side of the decades or is it leading?
I'm not sure we can answer that. The landfill is an old landfill, so it wouldn't surprise me if things have been leaching for a while, but we don't have the data to indicate that at this point.
I mean, there haven't been that many offsite down gradient wells.
We haven't had.
Until recently.
Data that we may be able to look at and see what, if they sample for 1,4-dioxane, we could look at that and compare the numbers and see if it's changed over.
I think to start evaluating that, we'd also have to understand something about the source. How what's in the landfill that has 1,4-dioxane is able to get there. It could be confining layers that are like causing it to come out slowly. It could be dependent on if we have a lot of rain in a year. And as we work on, and we're going to talk about this next, but as we work on the remedies for the site and we get engineered covers in place, that should cut down on even more of that infiltration from rainwater. So there's a lot of different effects that could change how much and how quickly. And I don't think we have that data yet.
Yeah, and I'm not sure we will have the data for historically. Frankly, I'm not sure we will have that.
But as we collect more rounds of data, we'll be able to conduct better statistics about how things are changing in near term and how
Right.
quickly they're migrating in near term. So that's why we're doing the multiple rounds of data, so we can assess those trends and see what's happening right now.
Okay, so what's next? So groundwater sampling, we've been through and we know about the modifications, temporary modifications to the frequency. So there's also monthly well gauging that goes on, both manually to determine the elevation of the groundwater. So there's manual measurements and there's also automated probes that are in many of the wells that continuously record what the water level is, so we can see how things change seasonally and with changes in levels of the river to have a more complete understanding of the groundwater flow regime for the site. Annual reports, again, the next one is beginning of April for 2023. Those are ongoing and in progress. Part of the settlement agreement talks about groundwater modeling, where a groundwater flow model will be established for the site. One big advantage of a groundwater flow model is that it's predictive. You can use it. It's a useful tool to predict different scenarios for how groundwater will flow, and it can also inform the feasibility study when you're looking at different alternatives for cleanup. So that's something else. Baseline risk assessment, human health risk assessment. That's part of the RIFS process. All the groundwater data and all of the other information that we've collected at the site about receptors, about wells, offsite wells, will go into the baseline risk assessment to provide an assessment for, what the risks are to human health and the environment. And then eventually there will be a remedial investigation feasibility study report. Again, that's after all the sampling of the well network is completed and the completion of the risk assessment for that. And so, and then the last thing I wanted to touch on was the dashboard and the refinement. We've heard the feedback that, it's a helpful thing to have. So we're glad to do it. And so we're continuously updating it with more information, but as you've seen, a lot of information is generated, a lot of it of a technical nature, so it's a bit of a challenge to organize and be able to communicate that information in an effective way to the people who want to know. And so we always welcome your feedback, your comments and suggestions on what we can do, how we can improve it. And there's a URL for where you can find the dashboard. And so.
One other thing, the baseline risk assessment is going to be important for the 1,4-dioxane because there is not an MCL. So the risk assessment will help us determine what an appropriate cleanup level is.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I said for 1,4-dioxane, there is not an MCL, a federal maximum cleanup level. And so cleanup levels for that compound will be assessed as part of the risk assessment.
What do other states usually have an MCL for that number?
The MCL is federal, so there is no federal.
I know, but
number.
do other states have an MCL for their state?
I do not know. We can check on that, but. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
So when we all were discussing about the different types of wells and the private well, and you stated that, none of the private wells are used for drinking water. How did you determine the type of testing?
Well, do you want to answer? The PRPs they've looked at all kinds of databases, like USGS has a database. The Missouri Department of Health and Safety has a database. So they looked at all of these databases that are available to see where the wells are and what the purpose of that well is. We did find there was one well listed as a domestic well just north of the site, upgrade end of the site. They went and talked to those people. What is this well used for? How often is it used, etc. It was actually listed incorrectly. It was not a domestic well. It was used for industrial purposes. But because it was so close to the site, we requested that the respondents collect a sample from that. And we do not have the results for that yet. But so we are looking at wells that are potentially down gradient, and what they do is go and actually talk to the people who own that well or have that well on their property to have a better understanding of what it's used for. And then based on that, we can collect samples from those wells if it's in an appropriate location that would help us understand the data better. So we have not found, and we've continued to ask for people if they're aware of any drinking water wells in the immediate vicinity that we're looking at, please let us know. Because that is something, I mean, we're looking ourselves as hard as we can, but sometimes there are wells in basements. I mean, and sometimes wells don't get listed on databases. They generally do nowadays. And, but, we want to make sure that we do everything possible to identify any wells.
And sometimes new wells are drilled too, so we keep an eye on that.
I don't think right in this immediate area. I think there are some further north beyond where we believe there are any impacts. But as we move, if the data leads us to go further in that direction, those would certainly be considered for sampling.
Can I ask one more then to follow up? How many of the contaminants of concern that you're looking for in the landfill don't currently have MCLs?
Good question.
One
and
for-
off the top of my head,
Yeah.
I can't. answer.
We can find out and let you know, but 1,4-dioxane for sure, but most of the VOCs and a lot of the other, the metals, arsenic, for example, have MCLs. Some of the radioactive, I think,
Most of
radionuclides do not have.
them do uranium,
Radiant.
thorium
Thorium
doesn't.
gross out most, that would include contributions of thorium, but yeah.
Thorium is also very insoluble, so it's very unlikely to go into the water, but, we're working on it.
So, OU3 is going to be to a sample site.
And I'll say this first before I ask the questions. It is frustrating to thinking about groundwater potential for us for years before it's ever opened up. I'm glad you're characterizing it. I'm not so glad that you're having to go so far off site, so I'm pounding into the plume. My question really is the plume. So was there going to be a dye test done by USGS at some point to try to determine flow underground, or what is the modeling procedure? I guess is the broader question. If you don't know anything, you can talk about dye tests.
No, I'm not aware that there may have been discussion with dye test quite a while ago, but not since I've been on the project. And the modeling is based on, it's a mathematical model. You input the data about how groundwater elevations change, where your wells are, what concentrations are, and how things change over time. And all of that gets put into a mathematical model that predicts future movements.
Okay, and
Groundwater flow, Doug, there's a whole further
it
network.
doesn't go the way you think it would.
There's a whole further network that aren't on these maps of things called pressure transducers. So there's even more spots throughout next to the site, downgrading and upgrading it, that we're looking at to measure groundwater flow. Typically, you all that know more about this correct me, but a dye trace study is often used when you have something called karst geology, and it's really difficult to kind of figure. This area right here, if I understand correctly, with the like alluvial sands that we have and then bedrock, I don't want to make groundwater flow sound like it's very straightforward, because the data we have does show changes over time and moves in different directions. But in terms of, how things are connected, we don't have that karst situation that a dye trace study would typically be a tool to help us understand where things are going.
This is flow through porous media, so it's like a sponge with interconnected pores and blood, as opposed to karst, which has, cavities. And
Yeah, tunnels where you see, like real specified.
Which would be much more difficult to model.
We also have the 1,4-dioxane, which is essentially our tracer, right?
Right.
In this case, the 1,4-dioxane.
That is your dye.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
the other question I have, you mentioned vapors chemicals that could be harmful in low concentration. And I noticed that there's some wells testing in occupied businesses. Those businesses have foundations. My assumption would be if you have vapors collecting under a foundation, you could be creating a pocket that would be harmful under that foundation. But like we do with radon, for example, that naturally here.
And that is looked at, right? And so what they look at every time they collect data, they're looking at what the concentrations are, what the depth of those concentrations are, and whether the vapor could, you look at how quickly things move from a liquid to a vapor, and you can calculate that. And so using that data, you can determine, could this vapor reach the ground surface at a concentration that would be harmful to people?
But over time.
Right, right. And that's what we look at. And so currently we have not seen any, they've done indoor air sampling on the site. So we have some building data on site, which we assume the data would be higher there. We have that to start from. And then the concentrations that we're seeing off site do not suggest that there would be vapor problems at the depth and the concentration that we're seeing. The science doesn't support that.
Can I push back just a little on that karst thing? Have you guys ever toured Champ landfill and stood down at the bottom of that quarry, which is just right across the street from Westlake, and seen all the karst features that are in that landfill?
I hear you.
There are fractures and
But
holes,
1,4-dioxane will be a tracer.
right?
Okay, no, I know that, but you guys are talking, non-karst.
I was out of my depth there. I should not use hydrogeologic.
Okay.
Not hydrologist. Apologize.
You know what I'm saying? Love you very much, Tom. Love you.
Just
The other thing that I'm concerned about, first of all, say awesome presentation, good job. Really appreciate that. I'm concerned. Let's have a separate discussion, if you will, after this about how to get it up online in a way that people will understand. Because I think the mayor will agree, when you see green dots offside and they have dioxin in it, people are like, this line.
Right, and it's 1,4-dioxane,
Right.
not dioxin.
Right.
And
Okay,
yes,
so you all already know.
we understand the potential
I'm
misinterpretation.
thinking we're all gonna be busy for all the way through the holidays with people freaking out saying there's dioxin over here, and we better.
Well, and we can make a statement on the dashboard to that effect. That's not a problem. And we do want your input, because one of the challenges, we have over 300 constituents that we're analyzing for in each sampling point. Some wells have 5 sampling points. How do you present that on a figure that people can understand?
That's right.
And that's the challenge. And that's why we've picked currently 1,4-dioxane, because it moves the fastest
Yeah.
and the most freely. Radium, because it's the one most people are most concerned about. And then I think arsenic, I'm not sure why we picked arsenic, but that was another one that was.
It's frequently seen in the landfill, but again, it's a metal, so we typically just not.
Yeah.
It's naturally occurring, but it also,
And
the landfill leachate can help release arsenic from bedrock.
Yeah.
And so that's another one that we're checking on associated with the plant.
Because I think our challenge is gonna be, we wanna make sure people understand it, but more so that they don't misunderstand it.
Right.
You know, I
Right.
can really see, I think this is more challenging groundwater. You've got your hands full, Snake.
Good.
Because I think this is more challenging than understanding the soil
Right.
and what's going on site. And it just has more moving pieces and whatnot. So-
Right. So I appreciate the suggestion. I think we do, I think it would be helpful to have a working session where you guys help us understand what's going to be most useful to the public.
Let's not throw this right up on the dashboard.
Right, and that's why right now we have well locations, and I think that's all. The data is posted, the 2022 annual report is, I believe it's on the site profile page. If it's not currently, it is about to be
Okay.
posted on the site profile page. So if people are really interested, they can get into the data from our webpage. It's available to people, but you kind of have to read and get more information. It's not like looking at a map and being able to misinterpret something easily.
Yeah.
So that's why we're presenting it the way we are. I think Bob was saying.
Could you throw up maps on there again and point out where Spanish Village subdivision is, because most of it's cut off before. We've seen some of that on.
Go ahead and put that up, and I'll have this out there.
Gradient.
which one?
But in terms of
Put the
the
radio.
maps for Spanish Village in terms of old streets, I don't know where that is since I
Okay.
live there, that's.
Yeah.
And also the businesses that are, fairly, and as well as the youth,
Yeah.
Oh,
which used to be the. Of course,
This is the rating, and this is the most recent data. So that would be the second quarter of.
where Spanish Village subdivision.
Spanish Village is
Dioxin,
right
azodite.
Right down here.
away.
Snake. Can you point this
I
map?
think it's cut out. It's like here.
Well, it's probably south of here, right?
It is.
You want to show?
Kind of
Right.
covered by the.
Yeah, it's underneath the boxes, right, which we can't move. So better off looking at those.
Yeah, yeah. Just
That,
see it.
no, and that's why these are the upgrading wells. These are the. And they. North and then northwest.
What I'm talking about, well,
Spanish.
Okay,
I'll pull it up real quick.
We have these wells rounding it to check in that direction, and we're not seeing.
Give us the chance to do them on that page.
So we're not, there's not a plan at this point with it. Wells.
I know it's here. There was a street that ran there in that property. And expanded, subdivision.
Thing, right? Yeah.
See now. Bulldoze all that out. I asked him.
Zoom out on that.
Look for the playground. It's on corporate exchange now. There you go.
And let's go back to OU1.
Well, I have a question about.
Okay, here is Spanish Village. And these are. It's this area right here. Harvey?
Yeah, I have can we get a little bit more of that?
Yeah, let's, Harvey has a question and then we're gonna switch to OU1.
Thank you. So you mentioned, I have two questions, actually. You mentioned this is an industrial use of health. Is there any concern that they may be using contaminated water that is then being incorporated into a product and put out into our communities?
The well that I'm talking about, no, not for that particular well, and it's being sampled, so we will know if there's any contamination in it. And we would have to look at the table and evaluate that. Usually, most production processes would drive off any VOCs, but I can't say for sure. So we can consider.
It's not going to drive that off.
Right, and we're not seeing, high concentrations of radium. There's one well offsite that exceeds the radium MCL. The rest, so far, do not. So that's.
Second question, assuming once all this is done, I know this is really kind of a future question, but a hypothetical. Can I think this community is going to be very concerned about another disruption to the community to put whatever remediation in place is necessary for us to agree. Can you, either in this meeting or another meeting, outline some of the possible remediations that would happen here for OU3 should you decide it needs to be remediated?
Yeah, I think it is premature to talk about that. We need to understand what contaminants are there because that drives what kind of remediation you need. One of the most basic things would be an extraction well that basically you're pumping the water out and you're keeping it closer to the site, not allowing it to into the mine. So that's the most basic thing would be a containment well. And then there are different kinds of treatments that you can put on those, the water that is pumped out to treat whatever contaminants are in that water. There are other things that can be done for certain compounds, like if you have really high chlorinated solvents, sometimes they'll put in an iron wall as iron filings. You dig it, when the solvent migrates through it, it dissolves. I mean, it basically degrades to something else. We don't see those levels of VOCs here. So we don't think that something like that, which could be disruptive, is a potential here.
And then my last question on that line is, again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I think it was a great presentation, by the way. And I think you guys are doing a good job. Any guess on the time frame for this investigation to conclude? Let me put it this way. We're talking decades or years.
I don't have a time frame, but I'm guessing years.
You have to get the.
We're first, we have to get the data first, and then they have to compile and evaluate that data. So the remedial investigation, once we have the entire network established, then there will be additional sampling that's done after that. Whether that's, 6 months or a year, we'll have to determine based on how quickly we see changes from the different sampling events. That'll help us determine how long we need to collect data from those most recently installed wells to understand the picture. But I would guess, a couple of years at the earliest.
But I mean, have 8 quarters of sampling once the network's in.
Well, or it doesn't have to be 8 quarters. And that's where we have to make a decision based on how quickly, if we see concentration in a well that don't change over 2 years, then we can be pretty sure that that's not changing in 4 quarters versus 8 quarters. So that's the kind of evaluation that will be done once the network's in.
Tell us about this testing timeline again. I think everyone's confused. When did the 8 quarters start? Are we in them? And which one are we in?
The 8 quarters is for each well. Each well is sampled for 8 quarters for 2 years when it is installed. Originally, well, wait a minute. Originally, when the wells were installed, we thought we would be done sooner. So the plan was 8 quarters for all wells, and then we would do the RI. And now, because this is taking a lot longer and we have a lot of data on site, we have more than 8 quarters on site. And we really don't need to know what's on site. What we need to know to decide what to do about it is what's leaving the site. And so we're monitoring the perimeter wells. Once they've met 8 quarters, they will be sampled once a year from then on, unless we see a problem that pushes us to do something more. Right, so depending on when each well was installed. So that's why, well, there will be that in the reports, that'll all be there. But it's just overwhelming because there is so much information. And so as we add wells, those wells start their quarterly sampling as soon as it's finished, and they will be sampled for 8 quarters.
The time frame that leads to a finite amount of data and then we do the RI is when we complete the well network. Right now, the sampling that's happening helps. It feeds information we need to do evaluations, but it's when we find the end of the flume and we have a complete well network, then we'll look at, okay, do we need that?
How much more data do we
One
need?
more year of comprehensive sampling and go to the RI.
But I'm sorry, I'm just kind of looking at this. I've been around this conversation for years. And I'm not as well versed as everyone else, but it sounds like procrastination through research.
No, I mean, I understand
You don't even-
why you're
we
saying that.
just keep adding more.
No, but
Monitors.
the decisions are data-based. If we see concentrations above an allowable level or above a level of concern when it doesn't have an MCL, then we step out to make sure that we understand exactly where that plume is. That doesn't mean there's not work going on right now to evaluate the data. I'm sure that they are working on evaluating the data and
Are you concerned about the amount of water in canals in this area?
the canals in general are shallower than the groundwater table.
I'm talking
There are
about
some.
if there's any kind of flooding, it could take all of your problems and just push that out and continue to push out the boundaries of your
Well,
plume, right?
the plume, I mean, groundwater continues to move and flooding can increase the movement. But more water also causes lower concentrations and dilution. And I know that's not, the answer to anything, but reality is it's the concentrations that are a higher concentration that would be at a risk.
And then I looked up dioxane, and on your own documents, it said 90% of dioxane is goes hand in hand with TCE. Did you test TCE?
Yeah, we're not seeing the TCE.
Okay.
Right. And that's actually, this is kind of ironic, but I was frankly personally surprised at the concentrations that we're seeing. Low, much lower than I would expect from a landfill of this age and of the history of what was disposed of here. I think partly that may be the SSE may have,
Converted.
yeah, may have to, that may be why we're not seeing VOCs. I know, it's ironic, and that's, yeah.
Don't worry.
Uh,
It said it has.
They were monitored and it's fairly quickly diluted based on, you're going from underground to the whole air system. So in a very close space, yes, it can be a concern. That's why indoor air is a concern. And so it's a possible concern, but as you move further away from the landfill, that would be diluted away pretty rapidly.
Potentially people living in the mobile home or Spanish Village who had gotten that odor into their homes, could it have settled into their houses?
Let's,
I mean, I'm not a scientist, I don't understand.
let's back up because there was air monitoring data.
Right.
For a number of years, not the entirety of the time that the SSE was happening, but there's air monitoring data where health folks have looked at some of that, report about that. We don't know what Chris was saying, but we don't know that. But it definitely, I understand Chris when she says for a landfill of this age, it doesn't have any sort of liner. What was potentially disposable of landfill. It is unexpected that the levels of a lot of common old landfill contaminants that are seen around the site are so low. But we don't know why.
exactly why.
We're gonna call it a blessing, say, you know what, maybe we got lucky on one living thing at this site. Mr. Vermont, Councilman Vermont.
Yes, part of what the city is doing or ongoing, we recently replaced all the playground equipment in Spanish Village playground. And that involved, of course, removing the old stuff and some minor excavation. We asked, that if you guys at the opportunity would take a sampling right at the playground, you can send it. That was done last month. So we have, going back to Mr. Nolan's concern and our concern about the safety of the Spanish Village. Now, to me, we have a direct sample. I mean, right out of that playground, we should have
Yeah.
results when.
Hopefully later this month. And we will provide those to the city first because that's city's property. So we always provide the data. And then once, we have provided it and explained it to the city, then we will post the data, on the site profile
And I
page.
want to thank you. And very surprised when that suggestion was made about the sampling. I said, I'll ask, but I don't have a lot of hope, but for great concern, you can send it. Thank you.
Yeah, and we can't do that everywhere, but there was a rationale. First of all, it was children playing there. It's also the closest public park to the landfill. So if we didn't see it there, we felt that it's not likely to be in the other areas. So because of the location and the purpose of that park, we felt that that was an appropriate place to elect a sample.
All right, thank you.
Bravo, thank you for putting kids first. Now, if only the Army or the other agencies would follow. Thank you.
We could talk
Representative
more.
Nixon,
Oh,
okay.
question.
From listening other experiences, you guys stated that there are many partners that you all are dealing with. But on the slide that you showed, it shows that a picture of the people taking the samples, they do not have a protective gear for exposure.
Right.
Is that normal practices?
For groundwater, they wear gloves and they would wear a hard hat and steel-toed boots. But for the groundwater sampling, there is not a risk at these concentrations that we're seeing for just breathing when you're collecting those samples. So now at some sites that I have seen there, when the concentrations are really high, I have worn a respirator to collect samples, but that's pretty rare.
Right, but we've had utility companies come into these sites and they are not made aware that they are on a active site. And
Right.
they are not giving any notification that they are being exposed to any of this.
And that is a concern. And the institutional control program is trying to help alleviate that. It's basically a database that says this is a site and these are the things that aren't allowed to be done there, or these are the things that you have to notify somebody that could potentially be harmful.
Right, so it's communicated to the utility companies that, okay, well, they're coming to.
This is still in progress. So in the state, I'll have to look at the state's program as to how the
Currently,
institutional
there's not,
controls.
we've been trying to pass.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. Some states do have it, some states don't, and so.
It's big.
That's why
Not
I'm
a
like-
lot on that, you know?
I used to do a lot of work on institutional controls, but it's been 10 years. since I've done it, so I don't know. Yeah, let's move on to OU1.
On that topic, if you guys can get the dig rates of the country to look at those maps, that would be wonderful.
That's been a consideration, but there's a fee involved with dig rights that is prohibitive to some companies, so there's a lot of these things. I'm going to go through a couple of slides up front for OU1, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tom. But I just kind of wanted to go over what we want to talk about. I know there has been some concern about how the expanded rim areas are going to be addressed and whether the ROD addresses those. The short answer is yes, they will be addressed under this ROD, but we have to go through a process to incorporate that into the site. There are other potential changes, minor changes to the remedy that will also be documented. When it's very common to have changes when you go from a ROD to actually implementing it. And there are 3 levels of changes that we look at. One is a fundamental change. We had a fundamental change when we switched the capping remedy to an excavation and capping remedy. So because that was a fundamental change, we had to go through the whole public notice, public comment period, the same way you would for a first ROD. So if it's not a fundamental change, we have things that are called significant differences. And significant differences, it doesn't change the remedy for the site, but it may change how things are being done at the site. So for instance, one of the changes we're considering is instead of collecting confirmation samples while the holes are open, collect the sample, analyze it, and then backfill, where the PRPs have proposed and EPA thinks it's potentially a good idea to do borings around the area we plan to excavate. Tom's going to go into this in a lot more detail, but basically we collect the data up front instead of on the back end, so we know exactly where to dig. You go in, you dig up what you confirmed you're going to dig up, and you close it up. It happens faster. There are benefits. So these are some of the things we're considering. Let's see. One of the other changes associated with that is potentially using an on-site lab. We have required an on-site lab because we wanted to get the data back as quickly as possible when the excavations were open. That's not going to be necessary now because we're collecting the data up front, potentially. These are all things that are being considered, not finalized yet. So Tom will go into this more. So I wanted to make sure we talked about those changes so that people aren't surprised by them. We want to make people aware that there are modifications to the remedy. Those will be documented fully. Basically, what's required for an ESD in the CERCLA process is a notification to the file or to the public that says this additional information is available in the public record. What we're proposing to do is to potentially have a public meeting to describe those changes and give people an opportunity to ask us questions. So we want to go, one step further than the CERCLA requires, because we feel like people may have questions. We want to make sure everybody understands what's happening. So we'll work, to find an appropriate time. We're still working on what needs to be modified and making the final decisions. So once we know all of that, we'll make you guys aware of it. We want to go over kind of the remedial design status, where we're at. We've done a lot of work in this last year, even since May when we had the last meeting. And I think we can kind of give you a clear picture of the path forward. So we want you to understand what we're working on now, what still remains to be done, and hopefully a general timeframe for getting that accomplished. I cannot provide specific dates, but we will go over a general timeframe. So next slide. Okay, and I think I've gone over most of this. This is basically the ROD amendment. The ROD remains the same for the expanded areas. There will be excavation where the ROD describes excavations are appropriate. There will be capping where rim is present. So nothing has changed about that piece of it. And then like I said previously, none of the other changes are considered fundamental. And we will make all of the information publicly available and discuss it with you when that does occur. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk details now. Figure out the best way around the corner.
Sorry to chase you around. So almost all of this initial information we did go over at the meeting in May, but we didn't have the ability to spend a lot of time talking about it because we were focused on showing the data. So for now, I'm just recapping the areas, going back over the main areas of new rim. They're pointed out here on this slide. We've got that north surface water body in that drainage ditch between the site and St. Charles Rock Road, just north of Area 2, where we had some sediment show up with rim. We had to expand a little bit to, do I have a laser pointer? Let me get my laser pointer. We had to expand a little bit to the east here at the buffer zone and lot 2A2 area. Basically, they created another decision unit just to the east of where the edge of that property line is, and it incorporates a portion of what we call lot 2A1 into that background base cleanup for buffer zone and lot 2A2. The main new expanded rim areas is what we found in the inactive sanitary landfill and the CDL. That's what Chris was saying. Those are being incorporated into the existing remedy. And I'm going to go over on the next slide how that's being done already in some of the design documents that we have posted on our website, like how it is already being incorporated into the design. And then we had some relatively low concentrations of rim, 10, 11, 12 picocuries per gram of thorium in the subsurface, 8, 9 feet below the surface in the ditch between Area 1 and St. Charles Rock Road. So those are the main expanded rim areas. All of those will be addressed in this remedy. And this is how it's happening so far. So the draft design investigation evaluation report, that was the main document that we came in May to talk about the data. Also in that document are descriptions of things like where the PRPs at this point have proposed to put an engineered cover. And it extends that there are maps in that report that show that engineered cover going down over the rim in the ISL and the CDL. In addition to that, there are sections in that report that discuss the path forward for that lot 2A1 in the crossroads area, in the drainage ditches east of Area 1 and in the north surface water body. And what that document says right now is that the PRPs propose to excavate all of that rim. The details, exactly how they're going to do that, we're going to talk a little bit more in this presentation, like what's to come and how do we get to the sort of final design level, exactly what's coming out of the ground and where. We're going to talk through that. And then one more thing I wanted to mention, our most recently posted document is the revised excavation plan. I have been looking forward to getting to this point in the design for quite some time. This is the document that lays out where rim is being excavated and getting shipped off site. It doesn't say where it's going to go yet. We'll talk a little bit about when that comes, but it says where from the site it's going to come out of the ground. Our comments on that document are also posted. But what I wanted you to know is that in May, we talked about a portion of the CDL in the southwest corner that had some shallower rim at high concentrations. And that draft revised excavation plan includes proposals of where to dig and excavate that shallow rim. So the point of this is to make very clear to all of you that these new rim areas are being incorporated into the remedy, and the design is already addressing these areas in the same way that we're addressing the rim that we knew was in Area 1 and Area 2. All right. So like Chris mentioned, and we had talked briefly about in May, there are some other remedy changes that we are considering. And these are changes that the PRPs
raised to us pretty much since the beginning of the design. So a lot of discussion about these topics that we're going to go over are also in the design documents that we have posted on the website. One that I want to spend some time today going over, because we've not really talked about this, at least probably since announcing the Record of Decision Amendment, is the rim staging and loading building. So there are figures in the final feasibility study that preceded that ROD amendment that actually show conceptually how rim would be excavated, where it would be trucked to, and what this building is for. And I want to go over that and then explain what change we are considering and really why it's a great thing. So the rim staging and loading building, the reason it's a component of the remedy is because disposal facilities, many of you know this, they have limits on what concentrations of radium and thorium they can receive. Some of the rim, actually at the time of the ROD, a significant portion of rim was above the concentration limits of several of the waste disposal facilities. So in order to be able to do an excavation and ship that stuff off site, the rim staging and loading building gave us a place when we dig that high concentration rim to put it out of the ambient air and environment, stage it, and as we got other rim that was at lower concentrations, we could load the two together into a container and get loads that would be within the disposal facility waste acceptance criteria. That was the purpose of that building. And it was partly because it would take longer and require more handling to deal with some of the highest concentrations of rim that we had at the site. Fortunately, a couple of very beneficial things have happened since the 2018 RADA. The data part, what we found out with the design investigation and objectives that were specifically included so that we could refine the amount of rim that we have, not have to rely as much on gamma scanning and estimates to assess that volume of high activity rim. That data has showed us that within the areas that we are excavating, we actually have a lot less of that high activity rim. So having less means even if nothing else changed, dealing with that during RA would be easier. So I'll pause for a minute. Even if this change that we're talking about does not happen, one good news thing about this is that the design investigation has shown us that we have less of this high activity rim.
Let me go into why a bit, because when we were originally looking at things, they did a lot of gamma scanning. The gamma sees things like you can be a little ways away from the actual concentration and you still get gamma readings because the gamma, is coming off.
We call that shine.
It's shine.
Yeah.
And so when we looked at these high concentration areas, it was looking like they were, maybe a couple feet thick. Well, when we actually did this design investigation, the PRPs did much finer samplings, like
6 inches, 1 foot. Yeah.
and they did very, very close evaluation of the cores that came out of that drilling. Most of those high concentration areas are actually 6 inches to a foot or less.
Right.
So the shine really made it look like there were higher concentrations. We have the data now, more specific data that shows that these layers are thinner. And so we have less of that high concentration.
So in addition to the data that tells us that that challenge is less than what we knew at the 2018 Record of Decision Amendment, a couple of disposal facilities have applied for and been granted raises to their waste acceptance criteria. So there's a double whammy here. Some of the disposal facilities that we were looking at the time that we issued the Record of Decision Amendment can now take slightly higher concentrations than they could before. So all that together means that this high rim that was going to cause additional handling, prolonged staging, and generally make aspects of the excavation harder, all that's gotten easier. Now, what the PRPs have proposed is they believe that a disposal facility will eventually, even under current waste acceptance criteria, approve disposal of rim directly, like it comes out of the ground, like with a backhoe. They make a pile right next to the excavation and immediately come in with a skid steer and put that in a closed container. There's no prolonged staging. I call that direct rim loading. What that allows us to do is keep the excavation areas relatively small. It makes it easier to control dust and odor, and there's several benefits. But I want to be clear, this isn't whether EPA will allow it. We absolutely want that to occur. It is up to whether there is a disposal facility that will accept that and whether their criteria that they're allowed to receive waste will allow that. We won't have a problem.
Garbage.
Well, garbage does make it, that does add a layer of, there's as many places, as many places as the contaminated soil and slabs in the North County can go. Not all of those places, the material from Westlake can go because we have landfill waste.
Yes.
But I know that when they get into higher concentrations, most of their main source areas are already removed. So a lot of the work they're doing today is not those really high, not always. So I know they still from time to time have to go to a different place or shift their disposal if they run into that higher concentration material. So they have to go through this as well. But we do have an additional layer of challenge because landfill waste, municipal trash cannot go into all the same disposal cells that the other North Quarry contaminated dirt can.
Hoping we can. I
Right.
mean, again, this isn't a done deal. The disposal facilities will have the final say, but it's looking
So,
like it's a good possibility that
Right.
this will work.
You put a lot of thought into it, taking all of our.
Well, and I have to say that the
Response-
PRPs
yes, right.
actually proposed this. I mean, they recognize it.
Right.
So, you know, and when they propose things to us, we consider, does it make sense? Is it a better solution than what we had before? And if it's a better solution, we're going to do everything we can to try and make it happen.
so I'll finish this up. Oh, go ahead. I'll kind of summarize it like this. The main facilities that we are looking at because of their proximity and the type of waste that they can take, and to agree, it to a degree, it is also cost, although that's not our concern. There's a company called Waste Control Specialists in Texas. They have two different disposal cells. One is regulated by the NRC and can take very high level stuff. It also costs more to send it there, and it has more considerations around what can go in that disposal cell and how, because it can take that high level stuff. A short distance away, they have a disposal cell that has lower limits. It's not regulated by the NRC, it's regulated by the state of Texas. It can take more types of materials, but because of that, they lower that limit about what they can safely store. That's an example of kind of how this universe works. The other facility we've always looked very closely at, which a lot of North County soil goes to, is US Ecology. They have facilities in Idaho, and they also have one in Michigan. The one in Michigan can only take very, very low levels, but it's the closest. And US Ecology is one of those disposal facilities that is seeking an increase in their waste acceptance limit. It hasn't been granted. We don't know if it will be granted, but we know that if it is granted, we should not have any radium or thorium that we are going to excavate that can't go to that facility. So
Each disposal facility is permitted or regulated. They have their own concentration
Right.
level based on site-specific settings and their permits and things like that. So you have to look at each disposal facility to understand what their level, what their limit is.
So a couple of process things on this and we'll move on. In terms of what the PRPs are doing, they are diligently working on what does the excavation process, health and safety, how does all this work, assuming that we're going to be able to do live loading. We will see those details in the revised version, the loading, transportation, and offsite disposal plan, which is coming with the 90% RD. And we'll also see some of that in the 90% RD report itself. When we get to next steps, you'll see kind of how close we are to that point. So they are actively working on that, and we will have design sort of excavation specifications, if you will, to do that. So what we have to do, like Chris was talking about on the CERCLA side, right now the record of decision amendment says you will build this rim staging and loading building, and essentially you will take the high concentrations of rim and process it through this building. We did not allow for anything else because we didn't know anything else would be possible. So part of this ESD will be to provide that flexibility. Again, we don't know for sure that it will work, but we absolutely want that to be allowed as part of the remedy. So that's kind of how this, it's already being worked on in the design, but then we have this CERCLA documentation piece that we have to do.
And so that document, to document the modification will allow, it's a conditional requirement. So it's based on the conditions that the disposal facility set. So it may be that they have to have a rim staging and loading building, but everyone hopes that's not necessary.
Right.
I know that there's some misunderstanding. Some people in the public think that that building is a good thing because it keeps stuff contained.
Which,
But really,
yeah,
it's being trucked across site and disposed of and moved several times. So the only reason that building was there was because it was going to be handled multiple times and being sitting out for a longer time period. So the building really was not a benefit to, protecting the community. It was.
well, it was
I mean, it
if
was,
those operations were needed.
But if it's not necessary, it's better to not use that building.
The other positive thing is that would be another step that would have to be done before excavation. So if we don't need that building, when we start RA, we're that much closer to starting excavation. Okay, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this shift in how we may do confirmation sampling. I've got a couple slides on that, but just know that the on-site laboratory, like Chris mentioned, they're kind of linked. The idea was if you have to do extensive sampling and wait on results to make decisions about digging further out on an edge or to be able to backfill, you need to bring every tool at your disposal to the site to make that process go as fast as possible. If we are doing pre-excavation confirmation sampling, then we don't have to go through not only the additional Q&A, and there are challenges in getting an on-site lab to provide the same quality of data that a commercial laboratory can provide. So what they're comboed together, and what we would do on the CERCLA documentation side is make that optional. If you do pre-excavation confirmation sampling, you do not have to use an on-site lab. And our preference is to have the better data quality that comes out of a commercial lab, if that is an efficient way to get it done. Okay, so we haven't, I know all of you probably have an idea of what is confirmation sampling at most sites. What is it for? I wanted to cover this quickly. We don't need to spend a lot of time on the site, but the excavation at this site is being designed based on a model. Yes, from all the data we've collected, and we have quite a bit of data now from the landfill and where the rim is, but it's still a model. Models are not perfect. So the RADA required a confirmation sampling program as that quality check or verification on that modeled estimate of where rim needed to come out of the ground and be shipped off site. The only requirement we put on how that confirmation sampling would be done is that it would happen during excavation and that they would need to break the excavation up into decision units that could not be any larger than 2,000 square meters, which is about a half acre. 2,000 square meters is a number that basically comes out of MARSM, the multi-agency radiological investigation, and I can't remember the full thing, but for type 1 decision units, which are those where you have contamination, you've attempted to remediate, and now you're trying to prove that you've got it all. The maximum that you can do that assessment is in a size of 2,000 square meters. So that's why we pulled that into the RADA. So what was supposed to happen is you would break the excavation up into these units, do sampling from them, representative sampling, and if that number that came out of the multiple samples that you took from that unit exceeded 52.9, then you would have to step out. You'd have to dig further, either push the sidewall of the excavation out, or if we hadn't gotten to our max depth of 12 feet, go deeper. So what the PRPs have proposed is to do that basically as soon as we approve the plan, as soon as we have a revised excavation plan that they can attempt to confirm. They want to start that immediately. Get drill rigs out to the site, go on the top, the bottom, the sides of the excavation, obtain these samples, and do this decision unit exercise without waiting, like while the design is still going on. That's what they would like to do. And this also comes with several benefits during RA that are very similar to what we talked about with direct loading. They can continue to keep that active excavation area size small. They can get to backfilling much faster and as they go. It reduces the amount of time that the waste is exposed to the ambient air. That allows us to control odors better. It allows us to control dust better and particulate migration. And here's the biggest part to me, it substantially reduces the potential for delays during RA, because we are not potentially having to change the excavation plan while it's happening and step out and have engineers do new grading plans and we avoid all of that. Another big thing is it reduces the risk to the remediation workers, because if we do confirmation sampling during excavation, it generally means that a rad technician has to go up next to the waste, not for a long time, but enough time to collect samples. And that puts remediation or radiation technicians closer to the rim throughout the RA process. Well, if this is all done through drill rigs, we essentially have none of that gamma exposure, like zero. And I don't want to make that sound like it would have been impossible. Like there are many ways that we can mitigate that. And we don't have that much gamma risk at this site. Most of our contamination is thorium, but pre-excavation confirmation sampling would just totally eliminate that pathway of risk. Did you want to say something?
I just was going to say that again is not a done deal.
Right.
We are currently reviewing confirmation sampling plan. We have made comments on the first one we received. We think we can come to an agreement, but we're working.
We haven't yet sent the comments. We've been having conversations about kind of our most important topics that we want to see them address in the confirmation sampling plan that they've given to us. But I hope maybe by Christmas, well, you'll see when we get to the next slide There are several documents that Chris and I have right now that we are trying to get through and get feedback to the PRPs, but go ahead, John. For the RD, for the remedial design, our PRPs are Bridgeton Landfill, Cotter, and the Department of Energy. They're who we have an order with to do the design. Yeah, and I could be more specific. When we're talking about technical conversations, we're talking to their contractor Parsons. We're talking to the design engineer and the technical people. We are able to interface directly with those folks. Chris does have sort of regular check-ins with the PRP at a much higher level just on how things are going. But the day-to-day, when I say I'm talking with the PRPs, I really mean their technical people, the engineers. Yeah.
So we use PRPs and respondents kind of interchangeably.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah,
make sure.
sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so those are the main changes, and I think you understand a little bit about why we're interested in those changes and what we have to do on our end so that those can be allowed. But they are already moving forward with incorporating those into the design. So where does that leave us? Where are we at? We just sent the PRPs and posted to our website the draft revised excavation plan. Don, I think you had included in some questions that you sent with us before this meeting that you want a summary of kind of like what's in that excavation plan. When we get to the end of this, I'm going to pull up the document on the webpage. There's a nice summary table and a couple maps we can look at. I'll just show you all kind of where we're at with that. But that plan was revised and submitted to us about 2.5 weeks ago. It is my highest priority because, as you'll see when we get into schedule, once EPA can approve that revised excavation plan, that sets the due date for the 90% design. So we're gonna go through that, but I am looking at that revised excavation plan right now, along with statistical experts that we've had involved in the modeling and engineer experts that are looking at like the health and safety aspect of how they're approaching doing the digging. And I have a lot of coordination with the DNR folks, Bill and Ryan, to get their feedback on what they think. So that's my highest priority. We also, in the last 4 or 5 weeks, approved 2 field sampling plan addendums. So I need to talk a little bit about what is happening at the site in terms of further sampling. You all heard from us for several months, couple of years, actually, that while we were doing the design investigation, till we had all that data, we weren't able to progress with the design. And yes, that took a long time to get to that point. We are past that point. We are past that point. And the design is progressing. However, there are some smaller areas of refinement that the PRPs think they can either reduce the complexity of the cover system they're going to need to build, slightly shrink the area that the cover system would have to go to. And so they have an interest in certain specific sampling that could kind of, like I said, reduce the complexity of that cover system design. I'm going to show maps in a couple of minutes or in the next couple of slides on what FSP Addendum 10 and 11 are. Those are posted on our website. That field work just completed last Thursday, I think. But there are 3 more like that, 1 that we're reviewing right now and 2 that we expect to get shortly for the same type of concept. But I'm going to talk about those. So that's what we've recently completed. What I have in hand right now for OU1 is that second draft of the revised excavation plan. Hope to get that out before Christmas. That is my highest priority right now. I have the pre-excavation confirmation sampling plan, like I said before, we've already started talking to the PRPs about some of our feedback on that, or the design engineers working on the design. Hope to get that out ASAP. That will end up being a revision, but like I said, if we can come to agreement on that plan, they will want to implement that confirmation sampling program immediately. Field sampling plan addendum 12 is also in-house right now, and that is specifically to support the design of the excavation in that southwest corner of the CDL. They included that, like I said earlier, with the revised excavation plan. Out of everything we reviewed in that plan, the thing that we thought needed the most help, the most work, was the optimized excavation design for that CDL. So to address the comments that we gave them, the PRPs proposed basically to disconnect that excavation piece from the rest of the larger excavation, go collect some more samples to make sure we've got good characterization and can get the same level of optimized excavation in that corner of the CDL that we have everywhere else. So it's on a slightly different path now. As soon as I approve FSP Addendum 12, that's another thing I'm hoping to get out before Christmas. I expect they will start drilling in the first or second week of January. And we'll talk about in future steps, but essentially they'll get that data. They'll put it into a short addendum that basically says, here's where we found rim, here's where we didn't found rim. And then between the 90% RD and the 100% RD, they will provide an excavation design specifically for that southwest corner of the CDL. A couple other documents that we've had for a little bit longer, site-wide monitoring plan. This is the document that says how they have to monitor, both to comply with regulations during RA, to protect workers, and to protect the community. It's how essentially we will assess whether engineering controls are working appropriately, if we have to temporarily stop work, if weather conditions make it to where we can't safely excavate. This plan has those details. It was required to be submitted to us very early in the design process, before they had a lot of the excavation procedures, all the data from the design investigation. So we're working on finishing up some comments to that, but a significant revision to that document will be coming with the 90% RD report, informed by everything we know from the additional data and the excavation procedures that they are working on for the remedial action. But that's everything monitoring. And then the last document I have right now on OU1 at least is the second draft of the design investigation evaluation report. That's the report we talked about in May. We did give them quite a few comments. And that document included an update to the conceptual site model. So there was a lot of data evaluation and interpretation in that document. That's partly why. I'm still going through it. I don't think we will have significant comments on this revised draft, but it is no longer critical path, which is why I've it's in my second level of priority. Like we need to get that one buttoned up and done, but it's not impacting the progression of the design. And the PRPs, like I've been talking about, they're working on that 90% RD now. That's everything from what the engineered cover is going to be made out of, how thick the layers are, how will it be constructed, how will they regrade the site, what are the stormwater infrastructure that they need. Many significant details to the design come with that document. And like I mentioned, they are working on 2 additional sampling plans. One for buffer zone lot 2A2 Crossroads property. There's an evaluation of sort of the next steps for what to do there in the design investigation evaluation report. Essentially what it concludes is that they need some more data, particularly in the deeper depths, like between 1 to 2 feet, 2 to 3 feet. We had a requirement in the design investigation to keep going deeper when they saw impacts. We think they found those impacts, those deeper impacts in those portions of the site, but they don't have all the data around where they found the impacts to be able to make statistical decisions or to make final excavation cut lines to pull that material above background out. So they're working on an addendum to propose more data so we can finalize the design of the excavation in that part of the site. Go ahead, Don. That's the very next thing. So no, that's fine. The second addendum they're working on, also in response to comments that we gave them in that design investigation evaluation report, is that they need some more data to find the very bottom of the rim impacts on that north surface water body. There were a couple of different ways that they were estimating where that was, and those are useful tools. But our feedback was you're going to have to supplement that with additional data. And so it's challenging to access that. It's a bit challenging to sample. That's sort of why we don't have they're trying to figure out can they get there and what type of sampling do they need to do in order to reach those depths and get the data that we need. So those are those last two addendums. They're working on those right now. I basically already covered this, so we'll just go right back. This is all those additional addendums that and how they fit in and when they will happen. This is a map. I did want to point out a couple things. So FSP Addendum 10, the sampling is already completed. I'll be working with Jess over the next few days to get these boring locations added to our mapping dashboard, along with what we have in FSP Addendum 11. And we will do that. We'll get ahead of that again for these additional addendums that are coming in. We just had a lot come in at one time, and the PRPs wanted to get right out in the field, and we also wanted them to get right out in the field. The thing I wanted to point out about this is these are very closely spaced and several samples here. There's something around 25 to 30 borings. What the PRPs wanted to do is one final delineation of this area that they could basically find those final cut lines and confirm that excavation at the same time. So after this is done, we will have a proposal in the design of where will they dig to remove the impacted rim. There's one minor thing that will likely have to happen during excavation. This blue line right here. There are high voltage power lines that run right next to St. Charles Rock Road in the site. They cannot feasibly, safely drill in that area without taking much more substantial steps, either temporary pause on power or special drain, a lot of effort. So what we allowed them to do is plan to do that during the excavation. They're going to have to take certain steps anyways to be able to dig there. We do not believe there will be any rim underneath St. Charles Rock Road because that road was there long before any rim was brought to the site. But there could be rim between the furthest out sample that we have found and the edge of the road. So as they're digging that out whenever they do that excavation, they'll have to collect a couple more samples to confirm they don't need to move closer to the road. If they find it, they'll have to step out. If they find it and it looks like it's going underneath the road, we'll have to address that. But we do not expect it to be there because that road has been there long before any rim was brought to the site.
Addressing it doesn't necessarily mean digging up the road. You could put institutional controls on, so
yeah, we'll
if
have
they
to
have to dig up that road, it can be addressed at that time. I wanted to alleviate some of your concerns, I think, based on that.
We don't need to spend a lot of time here. These are just maps showing where they did the sampling for FSP Addendum 11. We have this on the website. I wanted to kind of generally explain. There are roads that have been at the site before the rim was brought and throughout between the inactive sanitary landfill, the construction and demo landfill, and Area 1. We did a lot of perimeter borings around this road. But in the end, when we got all the data back, it was a little bit more haphazard, like, yes, we found it here. No, we didn't find it there. And what that led to was either they were going to have to do a significant expansion of the cover or a pretty significant excavation. They may still have to do that. But this data was to refine better our understanding of where rim is outside of the ISL and the CDL and Area 1 on these roads internal to the site. And if there is rim, there is some rim in the road, but wherever we ultimately find it, they will either put the cover over top of it or excavate it. And if it's below 52.9, they will probably bring it back onto a low area of the site and use it as fill, because regrading here is going to require quite a bit of fill to bring these landfills to the heights that they need to appropriately shed water once the engineered cover is constructed. So this is just to show you generally where that additional sampling is occurring, and that's kind of the purpose of it. Correct. They could take it off-site, but they're
Yeah,
not required
They're
to.
not required. So, yeah, they don't have to excavate on site up above or below 7.9. And anything above 52.9 has to be shipped off site.
Got it.
For disposal.
Okay.
This is an update of the slide that we had at our May presentation, kind of showing the progress that we've made since our May meeting. The main thing that is done is the modeling of the rim extent and activity. We're now just about, I think, to finish up the revised excavation plan. I'm reviewing that second draft. We now have in-house a draft confirmation sampling plan. So the big message here is you can see we're down to 3 more. Now, I've been kind of talking about this, but I want to be very clear. These last 3 documents are the most significant documents that we will have received to date on this design. This is all the meat and potatoes. This is all the specifications of what has to be done to comply with regulations, to make sure this remedy, when implemented, is going to be effective for the long term, which at this site is essentially forever. So I want to send a positive message that we are getting to the end of this design, but I want to be very clear about how much work there is left and how important these deliverables are to making sure this remedy meets the requirements in the ROD and is effective. So I'm trying to send a balance here. I'm excited. We're getting closer to the end, but we have quite a bit still of work to do. This is just a little bit more detail on what is in those boxes. So, and I've kind of hinted about this, but when we get that 90% design report, we are also going to get updated, much more detailed versions of the loading, transportation, and offsite disposal plans. That's going to talk about like what methods they'll use to put rim into containers, what types of vehicles, any specifications on how they contain it. It's going to talk about possible. We will not have the disposal facility, but it will talk about disposal facilities where this might go and routes that it might take to get there. They're working on a traffic control plan that will also be coming with the 90% design that will assess how all this work might impact, you know, day-to-day driving through this area, what they need to do to try to mitigate that. That's coming with the 90% design. We'll also get an institutional controls plan which will talk about, what can happen on the site after the remedy is complete and what cannot happen on the site and exactly where. We will get a construction quality assurance plan, which is a lot of those checks and balances during the construction to make sure that the cover they actually make and where they put it, that it is in accordance with this design. We will get, like I mentioned earlier, some kind of short addendums that summarize the data from these things and talk about what that means for minor changes to the design, where rim is, where it's not, et cetera. We'll get that excavation plan for the CDL. And then shortly after that, we'll get the 100% design. Once EPA approves that, the PRPs have to submit an engineered stamped final design package. And when we have that in hand, the design is done. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and she's going to talk through what we know right now about schedule and timeframes for the rest of this work.
Yep.
Sure.
One right there, EPA negotiating enforceable order. Where are we with getting our signatures on the dotted line?
The negotiations are actively occurring. There is a meeting scheduled for, well, I think there
maybe
was a
later
meeting
this week.
scheduled for this month, but there's a health issue with one of the people, so that may or may not happen, but
The legal
it
teams
is
are
actively occurring. There are discussions
constantly,
going.
yes,
Yeah.
constantly.
Yep, yep,
Yep, right.
yeah.
Yep.
we-
Yep.
Exactly. That has to be done before we can start the RA. We can complete the RD, but can't start the RA until that happens. We want that to happen before the RD is finalized. And we're working hard to try and make that happen. So this is as good of a schedule as I can give you at this point in time. And I know this is what everybody wants to know. So once we have that revised excavation plan approved, then the PRPs have 75 days to submit the 90% design to us. So, and once we have, yeah. And that's going to be an enormous document with a lot of information we have not seen before. So there will be some time taken to review that. That's something we don't want to rush. We want to do it as quickly as possible, but we want to do it right because this is critical to the final design. So after we submit those comments, then they're required to submit us the 100% design 75 days after we provide the comments on the 90% design. And then after we provide comments or approve the 100% design, they have 30 days to send us a stamped version that is, this is a go. But, again, caveating the time for EPA to review, for this site, I mean, we've tried to, do relatively short 30 to 90 day review times. We're hoping to do that in 60 to 90 days, but it's going to be challenging. And it totally depends on the quality and completeness of the documents we receive and how easy they are to connect the dots.
Negotiated this site in all of our infinite wisdom. We decided that we did not need a 60% design and we could save some time if we went straight from 30 to the 90. Now, we have done several things with the design contractors, with the PRPs, to sort of try to supplement the fact
that we do not have a 60% design.
Right.
Had a number of technical meetings where they sort of presented to us design concepts and tried to keep us more informed about the direction that they were heading. And that was helpful.
Yeah, so that we could say, we're not gonna be able to accept that. You're gonna need to look at something different. Or yes, that's a great idea, move forward with that. So
So we are,
say we're past the 60.
yeah,
I mean, the PRPs are past the 60. We haven't seen it. We've had a lot of conversations. So, and this is another reminder. So when we get to remedial action, the first step is not bringing yellow iron to the site and starting to dig, unfortunately. We first have to have that enforceable order in place. Then the PRPs have to go through the process of selecting a contractor. They put the work, basically the design package is put out for bids. And they will select a contractor based on bids they receive. And then that newly hired contractor will have to write a work plan for EPA to review how they're planning to implement that design. Once we've approved that work plan and the supplemental documents, then that contractor will start to prepare the site. They will, mark off where they're going to stage things, where they're going to, maintain the containers that they're going to put the rim in to ship off site. They'll design how the trucks move on the site to try and prevent the trash trucks and the rim trucks from driving in the same areas so that there's not cross contamination and so that the trash production can still continue while the remediation is happening. And then the excavation, once that site prep work happens, then the excavation will begin. So I would like to remind people of that because everybody thinks, oh, we've gotten to the remedial action, there's going to be digging. That means we're close, but there's still quite a bit of lead up work to get to the actual digging part. Right. Now, I don't care, the PRPs, the PRPs are responsible for hiring the contractor. So they will select a contractor. And the reason, they could put, I don't know if they would put bids out before or not, but. Right. Right. Well, I mean, they've had to do that all along. We've gotten a very competent contractor, Parsons, for doing the remedial design work. So, and it's in all of those PRP's best interest to hire a competent contractor to do the work. So, if there are any questions about their competency, they submit the paperwork to us and who's the expert and all that stuff for us to review. But it's very rare because it's in the PRP's best interest to hire a competent contractor, especially for a project of this magnitude and that has to last for a long time. I'm not sure. I think it would probably be private because it's a private PRP. Well, right, but DOE, yeah, we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. The way the remedial design has worked, the DOE is a signatory to the order, but they are not a decision making. They're right, and they are not making the decisions. They didn't want there to be an appearance of, yeah, they pay the bills. 1/3 of the bills, but they did not want there to be any appearance of that they're influencing things for the government or something. So, yeah, right. Well, and they have to meet, they will have to meet CERCLA requirements, but I'm not familiar with all of those, the contracting things. So, okay. Yeah, so I think that is OU1. Okay, Jerry?
So why did you choose, proposal trucking as opposed to running a rail spur in there and?
Not just, well, disposal may happen by rail, but not likely to happen via building a rail line directly to the site. Multiple reasons. There's some discussion of this in the first, in the 30% design report and the first version of the loading transportation and disposal plan, but significant challenges in being able to tee off of an existing rail line and get that like across St. Charles Rock Road and into the site. Very, very difficult to get that done. And trucking is possible, but I think the approach that's going to end up being the most efficient, and this is dependent on the disposal facility, is material will get loaded into a container. It will go on like a flatbed truck or some sort of truck, go to a rail spur within the St. Louis area, and then transferred from the truck to a like a gondola car, or they're
Enclosed containers.
yeah, we're not talking like creating a second pile and active loading operations, just transferring containers from a truck to a rail spur.
Yeah.
But
So-
we do not have that rail spur identified. The PRPs don't have permission to use one. They are seeking.
They're actively working on it. Well, because the airport doesn't want to slow down their work.
I mean,
So there's limited space,
approach, but yes, they.
and they did approach them about that potential. Yeah, yeah. So and everything that leaves the site, I mean, everything above 52.9 will be enclosed containers and will not be reopened till it gets to the disposal facility. Harvey?
I have a couple of questions. One is back to 2,000 square foot grid. I'm sorry,
Mhm.
square meter.
Right.
Yeah.
That's throughout the entire site.
Through the excavation areas.
No larger. So
So
they-
now you may have to do one test per.
No,
Minimal time. So how many?
That's a good question.
We're that grid.
That's
we're
what's,
actually working through that right now.
that's what we're negotiating.
Decision amendment does not have explicit requirements, but we are evaluating it based on how we would do any confirmation sequence program. So, we'll have probably type 1 and type 2 decision errors. They look at statistics. We will run calculations like you would for MARSIM or other types of statistical sampling schemes. That will sort of crank out for you a minimum number of samples.
Type 1 and type 2 decision errors, that's a positive error or a negative error. It's whether you,
And on the air monitoring, that obviously is of great concern to the community. But we have a chance to review that before you guys final approval. I would have a committee meeting like this about it.
So, well, we definitely will come back and talk to you about monitoring, and I would like to hear what you all, if you have specific concerns or feedback for air monitoring. I can't promise that we can do all of it, but I want to know what that is.
well, and that's something that you may want to use your technical advisor, Carmen King, to help evaluate, to look at
But let me explain.
and answer questions about that and provide suggestions for it.
When we'll know more. So the first thing that we'll be able to share is when we finish our comments, that site-wide monitoring plan, we post that plan in our comments. There's not a lot of detail in the site-wide monitoring plan right now. That's gonna be a main theme in our comments. But to be fair,
they submitted that very early into design. We didn't have as much information about excavation sequencing and all this stuff. So we will get them comments to that plan. We'll post the plan, or comments there. You could have Carmen review that plan for you. Work on developing feedback that you want us to know. But the PRPs will immediately start working on a revised version of that plan, which will come to us with the 90% for the available time. Well, the intent would be to follow the same process. We would give them comments on that site-wide monitoring plan and post that more detailed document with our comments. If not before then, it certainly makes sense between when we're able to get you that information while the PRPs are working on the 100% design to start, thinking about feedback. But I can tell you that when we're reviewing that document, part of it's primarily has to be focused on the regulations that the PRPs have to be. That's first and foremost will drive a lot. But we are acutely aware of it will be deeply important for us to communicate results. That there will be people that will be working in businesses in close proximity the whole time that this RA is happening. So in Chris and I's mind, that public communication piece, frequency of that, the type of information, all of that, we will be thinking a lot about as we provide our comments.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, that's an important topic.
Okay.
Carmen had a question. She wanted to know if EPA will provide oversight to the confirmation.
Yeah.
Yes, we will have confirmation sampling. Oversight. I can't guarantee that it would be, us there 100% of the time. We were actually extremely pleased we were there almost 100% of the time during the design investigation. We were extremely pleased with the work being performed by them. Found very, very few concerns. And so as you get to know the contractors more and more, you build kind of a level of trust and understand the things that you need to look at more closely. We will have people there, and it may be sporadically and it may be, unannounced. But there will definitely be oversight on that. Yeah. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that, but one thing that EPA does do on some sites is what we call a 60-second update, where we're actually at the site and we're saying, with a microphone, behind me, they're excavating, this portion of the site and the concentrations are at this level. And, this is exactly the process they're following. So that's certainly a possibility. I don't know that we would live stream the entire thing, but I think we could probably provide some examples and some image. Yeah, we haven't gone there yet.
There could be issues with whether we could do that site, but we can definitely.
Yeah. Interesting question, but yeah, I think we can, at least get some images out there of what's happening and how. Donna?
I don't. Talking about that.
I
don't see why we.
Yeah, I think, that could potentially happen. I have to tell you that those are pretty boring after participating in a lot of them. Basically, they say, we accomplished these 3 borings, etc. Yeah. 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 And that's basically what they do tell us. And we were doing that during the design investigation. We were trying to put out on Facebook, this week they've accomplished this many borings, and we would put them on the figure on the dashboard. So something like that, I think, could certainly be a potential. We don't have a new price tag yet. The cost is going up. And that's one of the things that will be addressed in the explanation of significant differences. Because if the costs increase or decrease by a certain amount, then we're required to put out a document that says the costs are expected to change X amount. And we do expect, just based on the size expansion of the site, there are pretty significant additional costs involved.
The current volume estimate of what it's gonna be.
Tom was gonna show that. We've got a brief update on OU2. I don't know if people want to stick around for that, but basically we've restarted OU2. It was paused while they determined where the rim was. Now that we have a good idea of where the rim is and where it's not, we've asked them to start moving forward on OU2 again. We're hoping that that moves in a similar time frame with OU1 remedial design. It's a much smaller area that they'll have to design a cap for, and it's a much less complicated cap. So just to let you know, we're looking at landfill gas issues and considering, whether there needs to be any mitigation of landfill gas levels. But those are the types of things we're doing on OU2, and we can provide, more of an update if you wanted.
So we're going into OU2 right now, which is the inactive ISL.
Real quick, I was gonna throw,
The REP, the excavation.
yeah, so you can see volumes. But I need to get out of this view.
And this can be found on the site profile page. It is posted for public review. And our comments on the first version are also posted.
Bear with me 1 second. Okay. Oh. So this is, let me zoom in a little bit.
Make it a little bigger.
Yeah. Make this. Hey. Okay, so little context to these numbers. We did include an estimated volume in the record of decision amendment. If I recall correctly, the amount of rim somewhere around 77,000 cubic yards. That was based on the data we had and the modeling of how much rim was present from 0 to 12 feet. But as you all know, the record of decision allows for that optimization where they go deeper for high concentration stuff. And between 8 and 12 feet, if they have low concentrations that require a lot of excavating non-rim material to get, they can propose to leave that behind. These are the numbers after they did that optimization process in the draft REP. So in terms of area 1 and 2, slight increase. I think we're at about 84,000 from 77-ish thousand. So slight increase in total volume.
And a lot of that is because of that new area in the CDL that will require some excavation.
But I believe because of the optimization and being able to avoid digging some of that non-rim waste, the total volume of excavation is not up that much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Which was the whole purpose of that optimization.
So the rim volume is up. We did find some more, but that is not for total excavation. However, we have a couple of new areas. So you can see the CDL. Right now, our estimate for that is the design contractor's estimate for that is 9,500. There is going to be more data. I don't expect that to grow or shrink a lot based on this new data, but it will certainly inform the optimization. So I guess I would say I'm hopeful they may find that there's more they can do to limit that, but it will depend on this additional data that they'll start in January. And then we have these other excavation areas. You see they're small. This is discussed in the plan. No model is perfect. There are some borings at the site that are away from the main excavation areas that are surrounded by other borings that do not have rim greater than 52.9. But one single boring will have a sample or a short interval in it that exceeds 52.9. And that isn't showing up in their model as something that they need to dig. So we required them to do a data evaluation and identify all those borings within those excavation depths that exceed 52.9, but don't show up on the model. And their proposal is to do short excavations around those and remove those, even though they don't show up in the model. So that's what that last row is. So yeah, let's talk about that a little. That's definitely, I understand why people would want to know the answer to that. It was one of the ways that we compared the remedies. The way that we did that is we used the model and data we had at the time for all rim greater than 7.9 at the site, all depths. We added that up. That was 100%. And then we looked at the partial excavations and what proportion of that total do we have? First of all, we found more rim in the construction and demo landfill and the inactive sanitary landfill, and that has never been modeled. We have an extent. We know the outer bounds of it, but we do not have total volume estimates of rim that is at depth in the ISL and CDO. We don't need it for the design, which is partly why we don't have it. We needed to figure out where it was, and knowing that it is deep, so it's not subject to excavation, we had to make sure that the engineered cover was put on top of it. So I don't have updated information to compare what percentage of the total this partial excavation is achieving. Of course, and we can pull, well, yeah, and we can pull language from the record of decision amendment because we don't have that percentage as a requirement in the ROD. So what was the purpose of the optimized excavation? It was to get that shallower, high concentration rim that presents the most potential for future exposure down in the long term and get that out of the upper surface. It improves long-term effectiveness. Sorry, go ahead.
So, question.
Some,
We
yeah,
pull that back.
some. Of course. Yeah, they actually did some testing of the aggregate that they've been using to cover. Yeah, I expect they will do some sort of test and evaluation of
Yeah.
the dirt that they
Or
would
that-
bring
or
on
that
site.
it'll be- That's gonna be, part of the, just the
Right.
logistics of getting that material to the site. Yeah, and that's why, they can use, like, right now, some of the excavations, there's no rim, like down to 10 feet. So they can, skim off the upper 8 to 9 feet where they can know, yeah.
Yeah,
They will be
Not
using.
that
stuff below
total number.
52.9.
This volume leaves the site. but not this bulk. But yeah, this is a significant amount that's gonna leave the site. And, you know, they may try to use soil from the Barrow area on the southwest side of the site, but what they have told us is they anticipate needing to bring in fill to complete backfill, to do regrading as part of this design.
Is these guys, you're gonna set a criteria for fill?
Yes, but there will definitely be specifications for the fill and the cover materials. In order to make sure that we don't have settling that we need to not have in order.
No, we're saying that from the stuff on site, they can use stuff that's below 52.9 as part of the backfill. What they bring onto the site, they can't bring anything onto the site that's higher than the rim depth.
Well, I think we know that too, that they
Yeah.
have big for properties, so
Yeah.
there's lots of extra.
And we've sampled, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's being used for bridging purposes too. So, you know, we don't know exactly where they're bringing the fill material in. We will when they present it to us, but more critical to our, I mean, not more critical, but it's the size of the grain.
Right.
And
the
that's
type
gonna
of
be
fill.
critical because the way they construct the cap depends on, you know, changes in the size of the material and how water reacts to that. So it's a very detailed design.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. I really don't want to have to ask, but I have to ask. First off, let me say, thank you. You're a great team. You're doing a great job with this community. It is acknowledged and appreciated by many of us. We were told for years that there was nothing to worry about in the CDL. And now the CDL has come up with a significant amount. I'd like if you can explain why,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
do you know how it got there, what the
Yeah.
story is?
We don't know
Well.
exactly, but there's
it appears-
a substantial discussion about this in the design investigation evaluation report. So I can summarize, Chris can summarize, but there's like a lot of information about this in that report, which, you know, maybe at some point, that's another thing to have Carmen take a look at, summarize, but happy to do so. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Chris.
Well, basically, when this was first discovered, when they did the article in the paper and the ABC came out to investigate, they did a gamma flyover. So they flew an airplane over with gamma instruments to record. And that was done in 1978. So 3 years after the material was brought to the site. They found.
Like 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
They saw a gamma signature in area 1 and area 2. They did not see a gamma signature in the CDL or ISL. They assumed, therefore, that it wasn't present there. And that assumption kind of made its way, that was the AC when it was turned over to the EPA in 1995. We took those documents, looked at them, and, you know, we weren't involved in that time.
So here's the
But
question.
when we looked at, but let me say, when we looked at the documents later, when we started looking into the details, Tom and I, recognized that the same activities were being done in those 2 areas that were being done in the rest of the landfill at that time. So to us, that indicated there was no guarantee, there wasn't something there. Plus the data that the PRPs had collected had stuff right up to the edges of that. And their model actually projected it slightly beyond those former boundaries. So at that point, EPA knew that additional work was needed. The decision was made to complete the ROD amendment to keep things moving because we knew there would have to be an investigation, a design investigation to complete the design, and that work could be done at that time. But we knew that there was a possibility for that material there. And I think you're going to the North Quarry, which
Yeah.
that
That's
was
the
being
question I
excavated.
No, that's fine. We can talk about that.
Yeah, but that was still being quarried at the time this material was brought. So it
But-
was not spread in that area in the same way it was used in the rest of the landfill. They were using it to basically close these two landfills is what it appears to be, based on the data that we're seeing.
So
Those two landfills were being closed and re-permitted, and that's why we didn't see the gamma signature. They were re-permitted in 1975, and they started receiving waste immediately. And so there was a relatively thick layer of waste so there was no gamma escaping. We were not seeing the gamma signature. So the gamma risk was not there because it was covered. And so that's basically why it was lost.
So Harvey, I know you remember me and Brad and eventually Chris talking to you about our conceptual site model for North Quarry and borings we had in the northeast portion of North Quarry, which is where that was the part of North Quarry that was landfilled first. And we did not find rim there. And you told us, not just you, several members of the community showed us aerial photos, talked about the potential for what if, rainwater allowed stormwater or allowed rim to migrate south and into the quarry. So one additional step that we did take during this design investigation was to do a couple of more borings near where we could tell the most likely stormwater drainage path was and down into that first shelf of the quarry. We did 2 more borings, went through North Quarry landfill waste, got to the old trash underneath, and those data and samples are in the DIR. We found in the one that was like further up away from the quarry high wall, I think it was like 11 or 12 picocuries per gram of combined thorium. So we had them step out and go into that next shelf. We did not find any rim in that boring.
And what we
So-
we looked.
Right.
So we requested that those samples be collected in the largest drainage features where we'd be the most likely to find.
Excellent, thank you.
Go ahead. Not yet. I mean, it's certainly a part of the groundwater RI. Continuing the ERM, the contractor, the PRPs have doing the groundwater RI is basically looking into the same mechanisms that the USGS team.
And they have down gradient from that, and we're not seeing, it doesn't appear to be migrating. So whether it's a place where leachate was able to accumulate and cause leaching from bedrock, I mean, there are a lot of options, but we have not found an answer.
If I remember correctly, 101 is down at the tip of where the SSD is.
I can probably show you, not that far south, but
It is, yeah,
Well, there was, I know there was a high reading at the very tip, the very southern tip.
yeah, I think it's like 47 now.
Are you guys gonna require, once the SSE is burned out, gone, subsequent testing in that area? Or is that,
No, because essentially they have put a very thick cap on top, and as it's subsided, they've continued to add material.
Okay.
So essentially, they have a cap, and that any rim would be below our excavatable requirement in the rod amendment. Yeah.
I know a little bit of that, but on the previous page, what I would like to see is, can you guys create a column? Can you go back to the previous one?
Yeah.
Quick. I know you have a column for everything that's above 52.7, right there, volume of rim, or sorry, 52.9. I'd like to see a column for what is total cubic yards of rim above 7 point.
Unfortunately, we won't have that.
Okay.
Now, we do have, I'll call it a reference. The language essentially that we use in the record of decision for them to try to assess
materials that they're going to be digging between 7.9 and 52.9. Figure out roughly what that is and attempt to put that on the bottom of the backfill.
Understood, that makes sense. Because what I'm thinking and what's going through our mind is communicating to the public. Yes, we have to make sure the public understands what goes where. We also have to make sure that we know what stays.
Well, and that we
Yeah.
have done.
Okay.
That we have delineated the 7.9 line, and it's still, that's some of this work that they are doing, in this, the North Surface Water Body, in that area adjacent to Area 1 next to St. Charles Rock Road. That's where kind of this final delineation, and the purpose of that is to make sure that anything above 7.9 is either removed or capped.
Okay.
But I will say that these excavation areas where we're taking this rim greater than 52.9, when that excavation is complete, there will be rim in those areas. If they use either backfill that is from, that is like above it, that isn't a part of it, there will be 7.9, between 52.9 and 7.9 rim in
But there
those
will be-
excavations.
But there will be a cap on top of that.
Right.
So that they will backfill the holes that they excavate and then put a cap on top of that. So there will be, that clean material that does not have any rim in it above the
This
backfill.
puts the
areas.
max concentration at 52.9.
Okay.
But it doesn't
Yeah.
result in removal or getting rid of that rim between 7.9 and 52.9. Multiple reasons for that. It's much more difficult to detect. You basically do sampling in order to find that. So the excavation
It's hard
doesn't.
For us, we get it.
Yeah.
We get it, but I will tell you, it's because of that though, that we're really gonna wanna have more conversations on those institutional controls.
100%.
Oh, yeah.
Those are where,
Absolutely.
Put it back.
yeah,
Critically
those are
important.
where we're gonna really,
Yeah.
Well, and essentially, I mean, they're
think our state folks too that are here from DNR.
absolutely, yeah, no, I think it's good. Basically, it's, the landfill is not gonna be, used for any kind of residential, anything like that. I mean, one possibility may be like, solar panel. Is that possible?
It's never gonna be a field trip either, let's just get that.
I don't
So
even
we're
know
not-
about that.
We don't know, that hasn't been evaluated. The PRPs are doing that evaluation and submitting it to us
Yes.
as part of the 90% design, right at the same time. And we'll
I'm
review
not
that. It
aware-
has to meet MDNR's standards for their institutional control. program.
Yeah, because I think for those 5-year reviews, are we able to bump those down to 2-year reviews? Or can we, are they?
That's set in, that's the regulations established it at
It's 5.
5 years. Now, if
Unless
we
something-
identify a problem,
Yeah.
we can, if somebody's digging out there in 2 years, we could go out and say, whoa,
But
stop this.
the O&M manual will likely have, I'm certain will have more inspections, more maintenance happening at a frequency of beyond every 5
Right.
years.
Okay.
Right, so now there will be inspections, right, and those will be more frequently, typically, I mean, at most sites, and I assume this one. They happen more frequently right after the cap is constructed to make sure it's stable, it's not, subsiding. That the vegetation is established well, it's not holding water in low areas. So we do those inspections at least annually at first and maybe more frequently. And then once we kind of get a baseline for how the cap is holding up, then those inspections could be reduced over time, once we're confident that it's
I think we'll get
Safe.
Carmen and our task coordinator, because we'd like to know a little bit more about what that looks like, just because we are gonna have things left over in this community. We want to know what that process for watching and monitoring that
Yeah.
looks like, and 5-year reviews, who can comment and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah, and I think there's information about the institutional control program on MDNR's website, so we would, follow that. That's the program.
So you know what, I'm just gonna say this for MDNR, happy with some of your comments, not your others on other sites. So sometimes MDR comes in really strong and then people leave. And then the same comments keep being made every 5 years, like we're seeing out at Weldon, and it's your force crap. So I think that for us, that's not happening here. You know, we need that consistency. If we see a problem, we see something that's not supposed to be there, we're gonna wanna know, the city's gonna wanna know, we're all gonna gather like this and talk about it.
Yeah.
And no letters flying back and forth for decades over the top of communities and stakeholders' heads.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've made a commitment to try and be transparent. I think that should continue into the future as far as, at least current, head of EPA,
Yeah.
agrees with keeping things as transparent as possible. So, yeah, I don't think there's any reason for that to change.
We're on it. This was 100% transparency as far as I'm concerned. This is, I wish this were being done at other sites.
Thank you. And we know that it's not all good news. We know that some of the information we have to present is not gonna make you guys happy. But we have to put it out there so we can talk about it, and, there may be issues we have to agree to disagree on. Hopefully, we can come to resolutions on things, but there may be certain topics that.
I
But we
overall
don't-
think you're doing everything that you can do by the book legally that you can possibly do to secure this site and get it done with. That's my opinion from today. No, there is some bad news that was delivered kind of by the groundwater, but I feel like you're on top of it and you guys are headed in the direction to figure that out.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything that we're upset about transparency wise about this site. I wish this was happening at others.
Thank you.
This area.
Yeah, I think as long as you guys continue to respect how you feel and things we're going through, it makes a difference.
Good. Well, and I think, I know that seeing things above MCLs is upsetting. We have, just to put it in perspective, the perimeter of the site has some concentrations that are higher, which is what we kind of expected. The leachate from landfill can cause material to leach out. As you move away into the larger aquifer, the pH changes back to more neutral. And so the radium, and other issues, the radium doesn't continue to migrate, it becomes fixed. So we have one well that is above MCL's offsite in the downgrading direction, and another one or two that are close. They're just below 5. They're in a general direction. I'm looking forward to getting the radium data for the next line of wells downgradient from those. I don't think we have that data yet, but when we do, we will share it.
It's now 4:00. Does anybody have any other questions?
Now,
They
can I
have
chime
contact
in?
information. You guys can always get their contact information. I say
Just
round
as
of applause.
local.
This is a hard thing to do.
I would also encourage you, if you talk to people that have questions or concerns, encourage them to reach out to Jess. She's here local. She will meet with people. She can, they can come in during office hours. And if there's questions that she needs, assistance from, she can contact us and bring us into the conversation. So I really encourage you guys to utilize Jess's presence here and encourage the rest of the community to do so.
Can I, just because I know we intend to post this presentation, so we don't have time to go through the full OU2 update, but let me just say like a couple of top line things. Landfill gas is the thing we've been watching very closely at OU2, migration of methane along the western side of the ISL. The PRP's contractor submitted us a report called Corrective Action, the Landfill Gas Corrective Action Plan Field Activities Report about 3 weeks ago. I'm looking at that now, along with DNR folks and folks at the Solid Waste Program. It actually proposes, it does an evaluation of all the data we have so far and proposes what to do to mitigate this, the migration of gas. So soon we will have comments out on that or approval potentially. It essentially proposes to do something for 6 months, continue to monitor and see if it's working. So you will see information about that soon. That's the primary thing that I was going to cover for OU2. Other than that, it was just showing you the rest of the deliverables that we have and the rest of the design process. So, yeah. So just a heads up on landfill gas.
Yeah, and the landfill gas is down right now. It's really seasonal. It's very much seasonal, and that's not untypical. I mean, a lot of landfills have landfill gas.
We agree.
But-
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, and, well, and we're trying to figure out if there may be, you know, associations with rain events, you know, after that significant rain in
Yeah,
2 years
that's
ago, July, we saw, because when the water infiltrates, the gas has to go somewhere.
Yeah, it's good.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.